Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our February meeting of the Policy Leadership Group. You have your agendas in front of you. We'll get to it. We have a lot to go through. We'd like to begin with the first item. As you're aware, we're working through the key economic spaces. This month we're going to look at Brandon West, the Port, McDill, and Port Red Wing. And that presentation will be done by Mike Williams, Commissioner, you're right here, and Gene Duncan. So Mike and Gene, go come on up.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, as we're going to go through the next group of projects and the next group of key economic spaces. Gene Duncan is somewhere here with me, because we've been working with the city, because as we get into this group of key economic spaces, some of those are within the city, some of them are in the unincorporated, but some of them are in the city too. So starting off, just kind of wanted to reinforce how we're looking at these. And again, we started with job clusters, which are part of the Planning Commission's work. And as we take these clusters, they become key economic spaces, as there's groups of them or large clusters of jobs. And as we begin to analyze those key economic spaces, we look at the transportation network, and we developed this concept of the spine and the spine network. And then again, we looked at the existing and the future land uses within these key economic spaces. Again, it's not just the key economic space, it's also the transportation facilities as they go outside of those and connect to other key economic spaces, with the focus being getting a system that's reliable, it has intermodal connectivity and market access. Again, the spine, we've defined the spine as the DOT strategic intermodal system, which is not just in the county, it goes throughout the state of Florida. And then of course the spine network is those facilities that help support the spine, with the goal again being that if our transportation system has greater capacity and works efficiently, that will support economic development in the community. So last time we had the cluster of projects that was in the I-75, I-4 area, included Sable Park and the CSX industrial area. This month, we're going to cover the Port of Tampa, Port Red Wing, McDill, and the West Brandon area. So the first space we're going to talk about today is the port, which the highlighted area, or the area with the red circle around it, is Port Tampa and Port Red Wing. The port has their own master plan, so we did take into account, or tried to take into account, what the port's goals are and what some of their projects are, and how they plan to change their area or develop the ports and move forward. So first, Port of Tampa. The map shown, as you can see on the map, the port is partially within the city of Tampa, and then also partially within the unincorporated. The area with the hatching on it is how we define the key economic space, particularly to the Port of Tampa. And then we show the spine, which is the roads or facilities in black, because it's not just roads, but also the spine network, which is kind of the tan color. And a big project that we're all aware of that was recently open is the Selman Connector, or the road that connects the Selman to the I-4, which was a big help for the port and will really help them get their trucks and things out onto the interstate system, or onto the SIS, or the spine. Next we have Port Red Wing, a little further south, and how it's defined. And you also see, notice in these drawings, that we're showing some of the competitive sites as well. In this one in particular, there's a lot of competitive sites within the port and the boundaries as we've defined them, but also some adjacent to the competitive or key economic space, excuse me. Again, we showed the SIS and the spine and the spine network, and we also showed the potential ferry project because we believe that could be part of the spine network if that project comes to fruition. So just a few facts about the port to kind of start focusing on the ports. The port handles over 34 million tons of cargo annually, which is nearly 40% of the cargo moving in and out of the whole state. So there's a lot of stuff coming through the port. And it also supports 80,000 jobs either directly or indirectly that are related to the port, and that's about $15 billion in annual economic impact. So you can see this is really a economic driver for this region. Moving on to MacDill. Again, you can see MacDill is on the on the peninsula down there in the southern part of the city. We define the space. The key economic space is not just the base itself, but some of the area around it. And here you can see the spine and the spine network as well. And then, of course, where the ferry might connect, again, should that project come to fruition. You know, here's a bunch of facts and figures about MacDill, excuse me. But I think one of the key things for this group is that the port MacDill either directly or indirectly supports a little over 68,000 jobs, which again, much like the port, that's a lot of jobs, and you can see. Now, you know, the analysis and things that we've done are assuming that, you know, MacDill will continue its operations as they are today. You know, we really don't have any control over what the federal government does if they decide to either increase or decrease operations at MacDill. So we had to assume that, you know, the jobs that are there today would continue. The next space is the West Brandon. And again, there it is, kind of in that I-75, State Road 60 area. We define the space, again, as it's, you know, south of 60, kind of straddles I-75, and then goes down to Bloomingdale. When you look at the future land use of this area, well, the existing land use is some office, some commercial, some very light industrial, those kind of things. And in the future, will be one of the most intense areas in the unincorporated Hillsborough. We listed here some of the economic development projects that have come to this area: USAA, the Bass Pro, LifeLink, etc. So, getting to the projects or the port. What we've shown here is some of the projects, and in your packets, there's a more detailed list of the projects. The maps you can see the maps kind of blown up a little better, probably in your packets. But these are the projects we believe that are needed for this area to have it continue to survive and thrive. This map is more focused on the transit projects. I think last month, we probably weren't real clear about the transit projects, and I think Commissioner Beckner asked for some clarification or to make it a little more clear, so we tried to put those on a separate map just for clarity's purposes. And here's where some of the routes would be. And again, the list also includes the new transit options. These two particular spaces really don't have a lot of transit because of the nature of what they are. They're heavy industrial or they're light industrial, moving towards more intense industrial.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mike.
Sure.
Real quick, I'm looking at this map and where it says the Port Red Wing and Port of Tampa roadway projects, and there's a green dots on here that says committed projects. Is there a list that states what those committed projects are?
We don't have the list of committed projects, but those are the ones that are fully funded for construction already.
Can you provide us those lists?
Can.
I get that? I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Certainly can. So you wouldn't expect to have necessarily a lot of transit projects because these areas, because they're so industrial, are more about moving freight, trucks, rail, those kind of things. Just of note, though, is we did show the ferry project here because, again, the connection from McDill would be down in the Port Red Wing area. Moving on to McDill. McDill's maybe a little different than, say, the port projects because, you know, obviously they move a lot of people in and out of there, so there are more transit projects listed there. This is actually the roads, and there's some trail projects as well here, and then, of course, the transit projects. And again, the details of those being shown in your packet, and the list of projects, proposed projects, in your packets as well. Moving on to Brandon, or West Brandon. Here's the projects that we're proposing in this area. And with the transit projects as well. And again, all these details are in your packets. So if we do all this stuff, what does it really mean? Much as we did last month, you know, we tried to give you a representation of what is predicted to happen over the next 10 to 12 years. First of all, we showed the existing condition. Obviously, the existing is existing, but in 2025, if we do nothing beyond what's already committed, you can see on average the congestion is going to be about 25% worse than it is today. If we do these projects, it's about 10 to 12, maybe 13% worse. So there is a big improvement. It's about half as much additional congestion with all these projects over if we did no additional work. And so this is the key economic spaces and kind of how we're building this. You know, last month we did kind of the USF, not USF, the I-75, I-4 area, and then we've added these additional spaces this month with the future, the other purple circles coming in the next couple months. So with that, I would love to answer any questions you may have.
Gentlemen, any questions? Mike or Gene? Hearing none.
I do have a question. Obviously, the work put into this was a lot of work. We appreciate the work. Great job. But one key fact I heard, though, is that if we do this plan, then our congestion will only increase half as much as if we don't do the plan. okay? If we're going to a referendum, that's a pretty hard sell, okay, I would think, you know? What would the plan look like if we kept our congestion at the level it is today?
Well, that's really the middle bar. I'm sorry, misunderstood your question.
Yeah,
Keep it at the existing level.
Yeah.
it's essentially, it comes to the point, so many improvements are required, you can't afford it, and it's just not really feasible to build out of that, or to build that scenario. You know, eventually, as things become more dense, more congestion, then transit becomes more feasible and more likely to be successful. So eventually, like, you know, you think of large cities like New York City, just imagine if they didn't have a transit system,
Right.
a robust transit system. So eventually you get to there. But just to build, again, mostly roads, but transit too, by 2025, it's not feasible.
Which is part of the why we're also giving emphasis to what we call live, work, play, and increasing choices for transit and all. Because as this data shows you, and with Mike's comments about cost, you can't just fully build your way out of this. We have to have additional strategies at work. So that's why we're trying to put a comprehensive set of strategies in front of you, for that very reason.
Fair enough.
I have a quick question about an acronym on the Exhibit 3.3 on the MacDill Air Force Base Roadways and Trails Project. You've got a line that looks like it's going up and down Dale Mabry, and it says ATMS. What is that? I wasn't familiar with that one.
Advanced Traffic Management Systems.
And
It's
which is?
essentially timing
Hey,
signals.
I think Commissioner Merman is actually answering the question. If you want to answer it, you can. I mean,
Let's give a test. Let's see if you can get it right, okay?
you know, I had no idea that this was a test, and she already had the answer, so go ahead and,
Yeah,
I'm trying to prove I know more than
it's getting the signals to work together so that you don't have to stop at every signal and
Okay.
things like that.
synchronization, things like that.
Synchronization, yep.
Okay, that's all I wanted to find out.
It's one of the things that we talked about early on, and your predecessor was here for some of those meetings, but that was one of the strategies that we talked about early on, is improving or increasing the efficiency of the existing system, and that was one of the ways we can do that
Okay, thanks.
with a relatively low cost.
All right, thank you.
There are no other questions, although we'll certainly come back if you have them. I'd like to move on to item 3. Mike's doing that also. FDOT and Tabarda simply made a presentation about their spine. We'll be charging them for the use of that word since y'all created it. Mike wanted to, just so you're all aware of what they're proposing.
Okay, here we go. So back in December, T-BARTA put out a document, and it was really their long, let me emphasize long-range plan for transit in the region, not just in the county, but in the region. And so I think there was some desire to kind of have just a very, very brief discussion. So I'm not going to go through the entire document, but just a few of the highlights as it relates to what we're doing. So they talked about creating a spine. And as you all know, and we talked about a few minutes ago, you know, we've used that term too. So we wanted to kind of briefly explain what their spine and what they're talking about. What they developed was, again, a long-term system for, it's a fixed transit, essentially a rail system. They went through a lot of detail and a lot of they gave a lot of information in the document about the different types of technology, light rail, DMU, what have you, and maybe some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of those and why you might want to use different ones. But for our purposes, they came up with this spine system that essentially goes from Wesley Chapel to the USF area, to downtown, to West Shore, and over to Pinellas County.
Mike, can I say,
Yes.
my understanding of what they presented wasn't to suggest that that spine was a rail system. It was to suggest that we had a spine of which, and then they gave the different technologies so that you could see how they might work as a singular system or interconnected, but they weren't jumping ahead to the technology that would be used. They were saying this would be premium, and the words they were using is premium transit. Premium transit can include bus rapid transit, does not have to be rail. So I don't want to jump and make this, that they put out a document suggesting that there was this long rail line connecting. What they were saying was that we have a spine, it would involve transit, premium transit, but there are different elements, and they were showing the comparison of the different types, but we're not presupposing which technology would be used.
And thank you for that clarification, because you're absolutely right. They did call it, again, as this slide shows, a regional fixed guideway transit, but that could include BRT,
Toll
as you
lanes,
said,
bus toll.
toll lanes, et cetera. So thank you for that clarification. Again, this spine that they talked about, you know, they showed how many jobs would be supported or how many jobs would be, could potentially use this system. But they came up with a spine system. They have a lot of considerations, and frankly, because this is a long-range plan, you know, we got a long way to go till this is implemented or fully implemented. But the point I wanted to try to make was, back when I showed you this map a minute ago, the main hubs that they're talking about line up exactly with what we're studying and what we're going to be presenting to you over the next couple months, because we have the USF area, which lines up exactly with what they had. We have downtown, we have West Shore. All this lines up, so their spine system really works with what we've defined as our spine and also the spine network. And with that, if you guys, if lady and gentlemen have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Commissioner Merman will be glad to answer any questions that you have.
I'll defer them to Commissioner Merman.
Commissioner.
Thank you for this and for the clarification. I guess I just asked, I mean, are we adopting this, or is this just something that T-BARTA put out there? Because, I mean, when we talked in economic prosperity, our connector went a little bit over to I-4, up 75 as the major corridor that other things could connect to create the network. So I just want to make sure that we're not necessarily committing to anyone. You're just clarifying
Yeah,
what
today-
T-BARTA meant.
Today was really just to explain to you, just very, very briefly, about what T-BARTA put out, and, yeah,
It
we're
was
not
not,
asking you to endorse
you're
it.
suggesting it's just T-BARTA. This is the Florida Department of Transportation and T-BARTA working together on what they considered a regional spine network. That does not mean that there aren't other corridors that aren't a priority or wouldn't be a priority for us, but just that as all this comes together, things will be feeding into a spine, which will go through the region and ultimately out of our county up into Pasco. But not that 75 or other elements aren't important, just that this would be the state, and literally this was the state with T-BARTA
Yes.
coming forward. This was not T-BARTA's plan.
T-BARTA presented it, but the state was
Right.
definitely a partner.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, so can I ask a question then? Are we going to adopt what we want our section corridor to look like? are we going to do that here?
Yeah,
So
that-
that we're
that's the
all on the
purpose.
same page.
The purpose of your discussion is to do that. This is simply an informative item.
Right.
Y'all will define ultimately, define the project.
And as we get into more of the spaces, you know, particularly the downtown, West Shore, what have you, we'll get more into those issues. The ones we've covered have been less, they're kind of outside the area where the main part of that system might be someday.
And I'll just say this for information only, is that, you know, if we went along with what they wanted, I mean, again, it's still, nothing's in it for South County, or really East County. So, I mean, I think that's what we have to really keep in mind as we look at some of these major legs as we go forward.
But there could be other ways even to feed the system, like maybe a BRT route, for example. And I think we showed a BRT in the Brandon going out to the eastern part of the county. Could have the same thing with South County, or maybe some kind of other or transit system goes to South County. This doesn't preclude us from doing anything. They're saying this is kind of their spine, just as we have kind of a spine.
Their spine.
This is the spine that they've defined.
Gotcha.
Any other comments or questions or discussion on that one? Okay. What I'd like to do is move to item 4 then. Thank you, Mike. Ron? We wanted to give you a quick update on the competitive sites. As you'll know, Ron and his group are working on it. But again, this project is looking about the county as a whole, both today and tomorrow, and so his work will inform this over time. Ron?
Good afternoon. I think, first of all, in Mike's presentation, walking you through the key economic spaces, you see that we are starting to integrate the competitive sites work with the rest of the work that's being brought to you. So it's to see kind of the totality of our planning efforts and to relate specific development sites within the context of either areas and then eventually certainly transportation improvement decisions. So as we bring each of those forward, you're starting to see the competitive sites work embedded into that. So number one, I just wanted to remind you of that process. But both as a part of this, but also independent of this, the reason that we're doing the competitive sites work is to have a pretty comprehensive understanding of our near-term development potential for sites that can address a very specific outcome, which is targeted industry jobs. So as I've reminded you before, our assessment of these sites isn't about the next residential development or the next Walmart. These are about sites that we believe are positioned because of their size, because of their zoning, because of their land use, because of their location, because of their infrastructure. They are, in the near term, going to be desirable to attract either industrial-based or office-based employment opportunities for our community. As I'd mentioned to you, we started with a pretty wide palette with a significant number of planned developments and DRIs. Our analysis at this juncture is just under 300 sites. 300 sounds like a lot, but when you really consider the entire development potential, we're down to under 300 sites that we're analyzing now at this juncture. That doesn't mean that that can't change over time, but it's a snapshot of where we are. As I shared with you as well, we're coordinating with the cities to ensure that the analysis is comprehensive across the board. So we're working with the city of Tampa and Plant City and Temple Terrace, in addition to analyzing unincorporated county as a part of this. So it's not, it's comprehensive in its scope geographically. You know, one of the outcomes that we expect from this process is really to address two components in the development timeline: timing and cost. And notwithstanding all of the data that we have, all of the permit processes that we go through. The fact of the matter is there's not in one place a comprehensive collection of any one of these sites, much less all of these sites, in understanding what their development ready condition is and the conditions associated with development. So as I've shared with you before, as much as anything, this process is about good business intelligence in our community. What we know about these sites and how we can move them forward quickly and understand the cost and timing parameters associated with them. More importantly, again, what we hope is when we have finished this assessment, we can give you very fact-based data that supports policy change. This isn't just road improvements, this is across the board. And toolkits that we can use, and you'll have an understanding. It won't be a generic conversation about policy or tools. It will be very factual based, and that we can say 30% of our 200 competitive sites or 80% of our 200 competitive sites can benefit from this policy change or this policy shift, or this toolkit can engage. And then spatially, on the map, we can see whether we're leveraging our investments, because we'll see the number of sites that we actually can favorably impact. So there's both an assessment of leveraging spending, and it's also a fact-based way for you to feel comfortable the policy is going to be meaningful and impactful, and the tools. And so that's a byproduct. So our next step, moving from where are they on the map and what are their compositions, is to get a better comprehensive understanding. So what we're going to be doing is trying to memorialize and institute what we're going to call a pre-development review process. And so we're basically going to take these 200 plus sites and run them through a review process with our teams, Water Management District, EPC, county, city, and treat it like it was ready to break ground. Not clearly, most aren't. But we want to go through that filter to really test rigorously what the conditions are there, and then what are the impediments to speed of development. And so that's going to take us time, because we want to, obviously we're layering this on top of everybody else's normal job, but we're going to go through that review process. So think of it as a pre-development review process. You say, well, why would you do that? It's to better understand exactly what we are placing in terms of conditions on these properties to move forward. How much of it's transportation related, how much of it's site specific like wetlands or storm water, how much of it's infrastructure like water, sewer, electricity needing to be at the site. But we'll have 100% knowledge of those conditions, and that's something we do not have today. I will say this, even the property owner, most of the property owners, some very sophisticated, but most of the property owners don't even have this information. So this is a very helpful exercise. So it'll assist the cities and the county in not only assessing how to leverage your spending for transportation, but also other infrastructure and other policy and tools of engagement. So that's kind of where we're in process on, and we'll keep you updated as we move through that.
Any questions from anybody? Anyone?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ron. Appreciate it. In our last meeting, we opened the conversation about governance.
I'm sorry, I did
Mr.
have a
Mayor?
question.
Sure. Ron,
The list we have here today.
almost off.
This is not a complete list of all sites, it's just for the 3 marketplaces we're talking about today.
Yes, sir. This is just this. I'm sorry, I thought it was. Okay. In our last meeting, we opened the conversation about governance, and one of the messages you sent us is you would prefer to examine existing entities before you looked at some new entity. And you wanted to know more about just what your options were with existing entities. So we've asked Chip Fletcher, the county attorney, to make a presentation here about the existing entities and what your legal options are on that. After Chip makes that presentation, you have whatever discussion you'd like to have with them. I'd like to step back from that and ask the managers to come up and have a conversation more with you about what's the purpose of this entity, what do you see it doing, and how do you see it benefiting. we'd like to have that information and discussion with you before we move any farther with this discussion. And then based on your conversations there, we'll determine what the next step is. So again, we'll have Chip make his presentation and as to what you can do with the existing entities, and then we'll get the managers up here and we'll have the step back conversation about purpose and role. So with that, Chip, there you are. Yes, sir.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My purpose here really is to give you all some high-level information about the existing agencies we have in place to help you all evaluate what direction in terms of new agency, reconfigured agency, existing agencies you may want to look at for providing future leadership on these transportation issues. And so I'll just briefly go through this and then answer any questions you all may have. To start, we did an inventory of the existing agencies that are out there, and there's actually quite a few, more than we would have thought originally. There's 12 altogether if you include the county and the 3 cities. Includes TBARTA, which is, as you know, a regional agency that has very broad authority. We've got the Port Authority, the Aviation Authority, we've got HART that we talked about quite a bit last meeting, the MPO that provides exclusively a planning function. We've got the Expressway Authority. We have the Public Transportation Commission. While not necessarily a transportation focus of this board, it provides a transportation regulation focus. And the Planning Commission, who does land use planning, but also in their special act is a review authority over the planning documents of the other agencies. So we've got quite a few different players in the mix. And based on our review so far, it does appear that Hillsborough County has one of the most, if not the most, fragmented or decentralized transportation decision-making processes in the state. Most of the other large counties have one or more of these functions compressed into a smaller number of agencies. So next we looked at, from the prior discussions and in talking with the managers, some of the identified functional needs for the new agency. The primary one that we heard was some type of a unified decision-making process. The lack of one voice has been identified as a weakness locally. The geographic scope is countywide. Long-term planning, in this instance, would mean planning on transportation investments to serve an economic need or achieve economic benefits, to include long-term planning that has economic development value in that planning process. Then near-term planning, meaning an ability to focus on what can get done in the short term. In this case, we define it as 10 years or less. Integrated system design, and this means an ability to look beyond kind of the silos or pieces of the transportation system to look at a holistic approach in all of the transportation modes. Project design and implementation, that's simply the authority and capacity to get projects designed and built. Land acquisition, construction, financing, bonding capacity, operation and maintenance pretty much speak for themselves. Some of these agencies, as we'll see, have authority in those areas, some do not, but would be critical to take projects from planning through to implementation.
Commissioner Beckner?
Thanks, Chip. A quick question as I was looking down at TBARTA. What is the financing and bonding capacity? What is their existing legal authority to do that?
Well, let me get to that
okay.
slide.
I'm
You're
jumping ahead.
a little
Sorry.
ahead of me. So that's where we get to the next slide, is where we've gone through, and rather getting into a lot of detail in a written report, we've tried to give you a sense of what the authority is in a relative way between the different agencies. And the first item on there, unified decision-making, there really is no one with authority to have a type of unified decision-making. It's really all either fragmented decision-making right now or consensus-based. We evaluated the agencies on their geographic scope. Again, some agencies are pretty broad, others are more narrow geographically. And on T-BARTA, one of the reasons we didn't rate them highly here was because they have a much broader scope than the county, and so they have obligations that go beyond just Hillsborough County, which is appropriate for a regional agency. Then long-term planning, there's a variety of agencies that have long-term planning authority. Near-term planning, again, many agencies have near-term planning, although in a couple instances there are planning horizons that are generally longer. Integrated system design, really this is another area. We don't have a lot of agencies that have authority to move into all the different varieties of transportation that we've been discussing. And so you see that the port, the airport, THEA are really focused on their modes. And HART has a little bit broader authority, although they're focused primarily on transit. And then the MPO and T-BARTA really have really broad authority in those areas. And then we get into the project design and implementation, and there what you see is there are agencies that have very strong authority in those areas where they're able to turn dirt and pour concrete and get those projects done and finance those. And then the planning agencies tend to not have significant authority in those areas, which is typical. Getting back to your question on T-BARTA, T-BARTA has a very broad, robust statute that covers all the types of things we're talking about, all the different modes of transportation. They have very specific statutory authority for financing, bonding, different types of indebtedness. And that's the legal authority. What they don't have is a revenue source which to back that financing. But for example, they have explicit authority for user fees, which in this case would be predominantly tolls, but user fee-based transportation systems, they could plan that, assess those fees. If the market would support it, they could go out and have the legal authority to have a fee-backed financing of some sort. So the statutory structure is there. But that kind of leads to another point of just because we put the words into a legal document doesn't necessarily mean that that alone is going to get where you need to be. You've got to also have the leadership to be able to put those pieces together. So T-BARTA has a very well-done statute, but for whatever reason, predominantly in my view, because of their really broad geographic scope, they haven't been able to get a lot of things done.
So they have the authority to create a user fee on where?
Well, that goes to one of the issues I think you've talked a little bit about is how you design and execute an effective toll system for a transportation system. So they could, in theory, design a limited access road and plan it and establish it in terms of ridership or toll frequency and proceed in that regard. At least that's the way the statute reads.
I'm just having trouble understanding because they don't have a revenue, an established revenue to bond against or to finance against. So that's what I'm trying to understand is what real authority do they have to do that? I mean, to create projects and to bond against them.
Let me put it a different way. I think if we were to have Bonnie Wise, our CFO, come up here, she would probably raise a whole bunch of questions of whether they had the financial capacity to actually go to the market and get debt issued and bought in the marketplace. That's kind of a different question as to whether there's a statute that says that they can go do that.
Okay. All right.
And while there are deals that are backed almost exclusively by tolls, and that's what this statute kind of suggests, I'm not sure they would have the financial history needed to go to the market and be able to place bonds.
There's no taxing authority capacity that they have. They cannot generate or create their own tax.
Correct, but you don't necessarily have to have taxing authority to have a revenue-based bond.
Interesting.
Any other questions on this slide? Okay. The next point was, really thought it would be helpful for you all to understand what the processes are for changing the authority of these agencies. Just in general terms, when I think most of you all know, but to have the kind of foundational context, an agency created by general law Changing that authority would require an act of the Florida legislature. For example, DIA is an agency created primarily out of general law, so a change to their authority would have to go through that legislative process. A special act is, or a local law, is a law of local application passed by the state legislature. The process for amending that is a local hearing by the local delegation, the legislative delegation. If they approve it, then there has to be notice published, and then the legislature would have to approve that special act or amendment to the local law. Typically, that is only done at the beginning of the legislative cycle, so we've missed the opportunity for this legislative cycle to amend any of the local special acts that could be considered in the future for future years. And then changes to agencies created by state law and a local interlocal agreement or an interagency agreement. We then have to do a two-part analysis. What is controlled by state law? What is controlled by a local agreement? And the agency that fits that description would be HART predominantly. The MPO also is kind of that model, but the one we've been talking about at the prior meeting was HART, so I thought we would walk through the analysis of this for HART being a little bit more involved in terms of legal analysis. And that is the two statutes governing HART that are relevant here. There is quite a bit more. It's all of Part 5 of statute, but it says a charter, in addition to the purposes and powers provided, shall contain, and then it has paren A, a formula for representation and voting of the members based on population, but in no event shall the governor have less than one vote each. So in the context of discussion from prior meetings, by changing the charter or changing the interlocal agreement, you all could change that board makeup. However, there is this constraint. The governor has two appointees. They have to have at least one vote each, and the membership otherwise has to be based in some form on population, whether that's through number of members, weighting of votes. However you all want to do that, you would have that flexibility. And actually what's not apparent from this is that there's also a requirement that each local government that's a member of HART or any of these regional transportation authorities has to have at least one vote as well. So even though you may have a smaller jurisdiction and a larger jurisdiction as members, a smaller jurisdiction always has to have at least one vote. And then the next bullet there, I've just kind of outlined the general grant of authority for HART. It's pretty broad. So we would have to work within that general grant of authority, or the members in some instances may be able to give additional authority. That's in a sense what happened with Tampa Bay Water. We went through a rather lengthy negotiation process for reconstituting the West Coast Regional Water Supply Authority. At the end of that, we looked and said that, well, what we've done, we've given them some authority here, some authority over there. Some of that was acceptable, but we also then went back to the legislature and amended the general law to a certain degree to fit what the deal was that had been struck. And then in that case, there was a governance agreement, there was a service agreement, and then there were individual agreements between Tampa Bay Water and the members to move assets and responsibilities around. I think there was something like 15 or 20 total amendments to different agreements or new agreements created. So it can be elaborate, but it doesn't have to be. So really just wanted to provide that information for your all's consideration as part of your discussion. Be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Mr.
I
Becker?
didn't really prepare any other materials.
Thank you. So does this, Chip, pertain to just voting members? What if we took the existing structure of HART and added members that were ex officio from other organizations? Would that require legislative change as well, or are we just referring to when we're changing the voting membership?
This would speak, I think, primarily to voting membership. There's no discussion in the general law about ex officio members. We need to be careful about what the role of the ex officio members were, but There certainly isn't any prohibition on that, so I would say that we would be able to do that. Obviously, we would want Hart's legal counsel to be involved in that process as well.
Right, well, my thought is like if we're going to integrate, or we're thinking about integrating other agencies like the MPO and FDOT and some of the other planning organizations, and if we were talking about bringing economic development staff from the county or the city together, could these individuals serve as ex officios and be part of this, of the makeup of the Hart Board?
That would be one tool that would be available. In doing this work, we've also reviewed a APTA governance study that Councilman Suarez was good enough to provide, and they have a lot of different variations unlike what you've just described, where you either have ex officio members of boards, or you have consolidated staff that staff more than one board, or other variations in that regard.
Okay. Thank you.
Suarez.
Thank you. Chip, I've got a couple of questions. One is, first of all, the first bullet point you have that is part of the matrix is a unified decision-making. To me, that's actually a policy question and not a fact of, the governance itself. And then that's just a quibble on my part in terms of you're hearing back from staff saying, we wish we had a unified governing, decision maker, but at the same time, that's not, I know what you're saying here, but it's not a factual thing.
Just see kind of how we got to this point. These are items that I think were taken from this body as what the previous discussions were as weaknesses in the current system.
Okay,
So-
it's kind of like, it's an outlier in my mind because that's really that's a governance decision based on, what we want to have happen, because nothing may happen or something may happen and it's gonna have a form based on what we wanna do. The second thing is that, on the legal authority matrix you have here, you don't have FDOT in here. And one of the problems that we have, both on a transit agency side and even on a city side, is that a lot of our decisions or things that we want to do are controlled by what FDOT actually wants to do. So that's going to have a much heavier, I think, emphasis in any kind of governance, than we have here, because regardless of the decisions or the way we want to govern ourselves, we have the overarching state role that we don't have any control over for the most part. I mean, and that's, I know it's kind of implicit that it's not in here, so I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. These are local and regional agencies. We've not included various other state or federal agencies as well. There are federal agencies that have a role as well.
It's just a quibble in terms of what you've put on there. It says legal authority matrix. That, to me, it's a little bit more, we have to include some kind of acknowledgement that that's there. It's kind of the elephant in the room that we don't talk about, because there's lots of projects we may want and we may want to do. And one of the things that Commissioner Sharp mentioned before, like BRT systems, if we wanted to use right away, we have to get permission from those FDOT controlled roads in order to have the right of way. So it becomes, more of a balancing act between what we want and what they are actually going to allow us to have. So I just want to make that point.
Any other questions of Chip? Mr. Merman?
Thank you. On MPO, so explain to me their primary legal authority. It's also, I thought it was a federally mandated organization.
There's two layers there. There's a federal statute, and I've got the very, very basic information. At one point I should make is, these are kind of the key focal points of their authority. There are a variety of other statutes that touch many of these agencies. But they are both governed by state law and by federal law, and I've got this federal law citation, so there's a basic federal structure. There are also then federal rules, but then quite a few of the federal requirements have an option for the state to establish either more detailed or different standards. And so then there's also the state law as well as to the governance of the MPO.
So if we would talk about the MPO being a part of another organization, what would be involved in changing that?
Well, there's two parts to that question. One is, as I referenced the APTA study, they had one agency where the MPO wasn't if I understood the study right, not merged with the board, but they had consolidated staffing, kind of like we have between the MPO and the Planning Commission now. And so there was more alignment in that regard. We would, if we wanted to merge boards, we would have to evaluate whether we could meet the requirements of both agencies or amend the authorities to have that occur. Under state and federal law, there are a few different models for MPO boards, and we have one of them. Pinellas County and Pasco County have others, and so we would have to look at those models, and if that's something you all wanted to pursue, if you thought that would improve working with the MPO.
So there's flexibility there to do that, even though it's federally?
Yes, for example, if you just look around Florida, you've got quite a few different governance models for MPOs, and even here in Hillsborough County, by interagency agreement, we're changing the makeup. We're in the process of changing the makeup. We're adding the port and the airport, and I believe there's a third member that we're adding that used to be ex officio that we're adding through interagency agreement that the governor actually signs off on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chip. Okay. If I can ask some managers to come on up and sit at the tables, please. We've, at the managers group, which meets monthly or more frequently, we've had quite a bit of in-depth and extensive discussion about governance. And so I'm going to ask Jerry Sieber to open the conversation by summarizing some of the conversation that we've been having at that group. And then Greg Hordell will We'll sit over there. Let's keep roles real distinctive here. Greg will provide some other dimensions of that discussion, and after we have that, we'd just like to have an open discussion with you. We're really trying to just step back and, what is it we want to do? What is the need we need to address here? You see that whole list of potential functions up there that were generated from the project management group in your discussions. But what's the value we really need to ask where we want to go? But Jerry, if you'll open it, please.
Thank you, Herb. Good afternoon. Last month, when you passed this assignment on to us, I made a crack about looking for new assignments and wanted you to know that this is the kind of stuff we like to do. Most of us have studied policy a while back, and as I had this conversation with my colleagues, it's pretty clear there's a little bit of policy wonk in every one of them that enjoyed this conversation. So as we approach this, I want you to think about three different questions that we think you need to focus on. The first was, why do we need a governance structure or entity that's different? What are the roles that this new governance entity would fulfill? And what authority should the new governance entity have in order to fulfill its various roles? And as we looked at that first item, when Mr. Merrill put this item on the table last month, we quickly went to a conversation about heart. We didn't have a very lengthy conversation on why this is so important. I think that from a public understanding perspective, it's important that we need to understand the critical nature of this handoff going forward to ensure that we have a smooth handoff and that the implementation is successful. We all agreed that we didn't need another plan sitting on the shelf and muddle through our transportation challenges facing the region. I think you also need to address something that was touched upon already this afternoon, and that's the merits of shared decision-making. With respect to transportation issues, the challenges cross jurisdictional lines, and you're going to need to have collaboration on planning, funding, and implementation if we're going to be successful. In terms of the roles, Mr. Fletcher talked about that in his presentation just a few moments ago. I think that we need to have someone who serves as the advocate for transportation funding in Hillsborough County, both in Tallahassee and in Washington. Those of you who have served in the legislature might agree that I think we are hurt in the legislative process if we don't speak with one voice for the county. The role of planning is also very important, both near-term and long-term planning. that belongs on the list of duties. We don't need to confound the funders by showing a variety of plan documents, each one of which purports to be the transportation plan for Hillsborough County. So assigning some of the duties that are now performed by the MPO, going back to the conversation of just a few minutes ago, might be appropriate. Not saying will, might be appropriate. We also need to ensure that the money that we commit for transportation has a strong link to job growth. We've talked about that repeatedly at these meetings. To my recollection, that direct connection has not been a part of transportation planning in the past. And thirdly, I think the entity should be charged with the power to implement what it is you plan to do. And I think the program needs to be accountable to the electorate. I personally like the idea of elected officials making the decisions on that because it just underscores accountability to the voters. In terms of the authority that the governance entity ought to have in order to fulfill its various roles, we've already talked about the need for countywide authority and a comprehensive scope of authority that includes the final say on project selection and planning, so that you have a better chance of developing a comprehensive, integrated, and cohesive transportation system to serve the county. Both Dr. Marlowe and Mr. Fletcher mentioned the language of linking all modes and projects so that we have an integrated, cohesive system. We think the new governance entity should be charged with the power to plan, design, construct, and finance projects. And that means that the power also to acquire property, to incur debt, and to otherwise get the job done. This would also involve the ability to contract some of these functions to other public or private entities. So P3 is a part of the power you should have as well to enter into those types of relationships. And in my mind, this is directly related to our need to ensure that we have some early successes and victories in this endeavor. Last thing I wanted to share with you is that the governance entity ought to have the power to operate the system. And again, perhaps through contracting with other public and private entities to get that done. My colleagues have some other thoughts to share with you, and Greg's going to take the floor from me in a moment. As you go through this conversation with others, you're going to hear some consternation. You're going to hear some objection to change. And I think that that's inevitable. But if we're going to improve our relative position in transportation so we're successful in attracting more investment and a creative, talented workforce in Tampa Bay, we need to think about doing things differently. I would encourage you to think about role and function first before you get hung up on what structure, because I think in the conversation, the best structure is going to emerge from your conversation. You have a lot of flexibility. That word was mentioned just a few moments ago. You have a lot of flexibility in this endeavor, and I think that you should keep that in full view.
Okay. I'd like to thank Jerry for doing those comments. He got that job because, one, he wrote a very thoughtful email. Secondly, he left the managers' meeting early last Friday.
Yes, he did.
So, Greg?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't leave early, but I still got roped into talking a little bit about this. I do think it's very important, as Jerry outlined and as all of us have discussed over the past several months. I think you painted a great picture for what we've been considering and what information we've shared with you all, and frankly, why we've shared it. There's two completely different sections to what we're asking you to consider when it comes to governance. That's policymaking and administration. Policymaking, we're talking now about the different things that we put into the competitive sites and how that's going to impact what types of projects are going to be out there. The bottom line, as you can probably tell from the title of this whole initiative, Transportation for Economic Development, is how do we get the best bang for the buck with the investments we make in transportation dollars that are specific to those competitive sites. I think Ron and his staff have done a very good job thus far of assembling the data and the information, trying to make sure that we have a good basis going forward for picking transportation projects on a priority basis that are going to make the biggest bang for the buck. And I keep talking about that because it's important. It doesn't mean that we look at only projects that are going to serve greenfield sites. Far from it. In fact, some of the most viable economic development projects involve redevelopment. Sulphur Springs in Maryland, perfect example. They put a transit line there, and that area quadrupled in value because of all the redevelopment activity that occurred there. So we have some, I think, real decisions to make, both at the administration's level and at the elected officials level, for what types of criterion we want to use to evaluate these projects and establish priorities. I think we also need to make sure that we have the elected officials, and I would suggest this body stay in place and oversee the first few months, maybe 18 to 24 months, because the accountability that Jerry talked about and the accountability that we're all sensitive to comes from you all giving directives to us. We're beholden to make sure we get that work done. And I think your involvement in this is critical. In fact, I hear that a lot from the citizens, from the editorial board members. It means a lot that this group is together and you're working on these projects. I think it shows some real leadership, and I know personally I'd like to see that continue. I don't know what we'll end up with on the handoff and what the timeline is. That'll be your decision. But I do think it's important that you consider that. There is one other item that we've talked about on the policymaking side. It's been a brief item, but I think it's critical. And it's the difference between allocating whatever pot of funds we come up with and whatever list of projects we come up with. There's a question whether we ought to reserve a portion of that funding for opportunity projects. You know, we've only touched on that briefly, but if we have an opportunity, and I'll use Bass Pro as an example, that was an opportunity. We got a lot of road work done. It's going to generate a return on investment. Some folks may not like that it was retail, but frankly, in the end of the day analysis, it's generating much more than we're putting into it. So from my back of the envelope calculation, I think that's something that we need to consider. Having that pot of funds available for an opportunity to rise is critical, in my view. I think we've got to figure out what that percentage is and how we define the criteria necessary to allocate those funds for that opportunity. Another great example would be something like Amazon. If, for example, they needed a large road improvement and we didn't have the funding available and they weren't really ready to add that to their development costs, we potentially might have lost an opportunity there. So I think it's important for us to consider having some flexibility. I know that's something that you all would like to have. It's something I think the staff would like to have as well, to make sure that we're able to look at these projects, come up with a reasonable basis for awarding funds based on that opportunity. Doesn't mean all the funds. In fact, it's only a percentage. We don't know what that is yet, but that's what we're going to be working out. The administrative side. As you work through this discussion, again, from our perspective, since we deal with this stuff all the time, we just need to make sure that whoever this entity is or whatever it is, it's best positioned to take your policy directives and actually implement them. And I think there's got to be, as Jerry indicated, construction, financing, project management, all that has to be in play. We have to have an entity that has the authority when there are issues that need to be resolved, has the authority on those smaller issues to jump in and do it. And the example I'll give is if you have an arterial road that you're widening to attract development and it's crossing two jurisdictions, if you have an issue in one of those jurisdictions with how something's going, you want to have the entity be able to make a decision, keep the project moving forward and not get bogged down in a round of decision-making meetings with different jurisdictions. Finally, Jerry touched on it a little bit, and we've all been sensitive to it. Operations and maintenance going forward is going to be a critical issue. You know, these projects, they're great, but they all come at a cost in future years. So we need to start thinking about, when we look at governance, how we're going to handle the operations and maintenance component of this moving forward. I think these are great issues to have because we're discussing solutions to transportation problems. I know that we'll get to answers, but just wanted to give you a sense of what we're doing as we sit up late at night nursing our whiskey, thinking about how to solve these problems. Thank you.
Everybody else want to admit to that, the managers? Any of the managers like to make a comment? Well, you see on the screen, essentially many of the roles that we've talked about. We'd just like to get some feedback from you in terms of what you think about this entity, if there is to be such one. What's particularly important for you that it has the capacity to do, where you think there are gaps that are particularly critical. So let's just go. Commissioner Sharp.
I like it.
Okay.
I like the way Mr. Sieber opened the conversation. The three things that seem to jump out at me: power to plan, construct, operate, or to farm it out to someone else who could operate it. Get the job done. Early successes, to me, seems very important. I think like most companies now that are not hiring necessarily area specialists who work in silos but cross-jurisdictional, the ability for this entity to work across jurisdictions obviously is very important. I think that even if they, though, do have, and I looked at the legal considerations and governance, one of the greatest challenges I think we've faced here as a community, whether you have the unified decision-making ability or not, it's how you use it. So some of this is going to be, and Chairman Suarez from Hart has I think made this point at times. Some of these issues are the governance, some of it's leadership. Sometimes when you have the power, like a parent, and you hammer down on your child without listening, well, the child may have to do it, but they're going to resent it. Or you can act like, I don't have an obligation to interface with you because it says here on the chart that I'm in charge. So my concern has always been making sure that we have that right person who knows both their role and function, but also has the temperament to be able to work with a collaborative body, because our structure, even if we make this change, is still going to remain pretty much as it is as a community. So we're going to have a collaborative effort. I think, and I'll just, quickly say, I look at transportation differently, and in particular, the way Hart has operated. Hart has provided a service to people with no other options and have seen themselves as simply trying to connect points, like a bus stop, go from here to here. I'd like to see the agency, or an agency that's involved in this process, that's thinking well beyond that. The way Apple thinks about music, or the technology they're developing, or the way Amazon thinks about a product, which is they're thinking about it from the beginning, just as we would think about our customer from the moment they wake up, how we're going to move them from where they are and live to where they want to go. And that means sometimes Hart might not be the jurisdiction which starts your day, but they're going to have to interact at the front end, through the middle, and the back end. And I want an agency that's thinking that way and also capable of doing many things at once. I know they need more money. I want them to have more money. But I also want a completely different agency, and I think that you all and what you've laid out is exactly the direction we need to be going.
So let me just summarize that very quickly. What you're really looking for, and thank you for elevating it up from Hart, is an entity that really has that ability to look at the whole system and how the whole thing's going to move.
If we are building stops, but there's no way for people to get to the stops, then the stops aren't helpful. And sometimes we have an obtuse attitude, which is, that's not our problem. We have to build a stop, and here's the road we have to use, and we're going to put the stop here. I want them thinking about that person, how they're going to get there, the safety of their travel, looking at a holistic entity. And if they have broader authority and a broader mission, I think they'd do that. When we're even planning basics, little things, planning roads, Hart might say, well, it's our job to put the stop on the road. And the county might think, well, it's our job to, to build and maintain the road. Nobody's thinking about, is there a way to integrate the stop with the road? And then now we're doing it. We've done it in the city. We're doing it in the county with bus bays and things. But where that's the first thought, so that we have a great bus, but that when it's stopped, it's out of the way. So now we're maximizing the utility of the road, getting more cars going, which ought to be Hart's concern. Hart might say, well, that's not our problem. And I feel that sometimes that's the attitude, which is that's not our worry. Well, it should be, because we want to get that bus out of the way, cars moving, but we want to get people on the bus and moving fast.
And we tried to capture that in concept integrator systems. Commissioner Chris.
Thank you. I thought this was a very good meeting, and things were very put forth, very clear and concise, and for the most part, I agree with many parts of what was said. Starting with Commissioner Merman, when she expressed a concern about the connectivity to South County, and I'd like to take that one step further, also out to Plant City, that we identified that those were two economic engines for our county region area, and should also be part of the overall holistic plan that we put forth. I understand that we don't want a plan that's too difficult where it doesn't happen, but we can identify it in priority phases. But it should be there at the forefront so that it's clear what we are looking at all the way down the road. Secondly, as I mentioned at our last meeting, I felt that, and I know a lot of people were talking about HART taking a lead in this, or possibly THEA. For me, I see those two authorities as operating authorities. THEA operates expressways. All right, so we expand it to roads. Still fits within their mission. HART operates vehicles, whether it's a bus or a trolley or some, maybe down the road, a train or whatever. They're into equipment, they're vehicles. The two of them working in tandem covers the mass transit. But it's a bigger picture than just that. We have existing roadways for automobiles. We have an emerging pedestrian transportation initiative underway with more bike lanes, more healthy choices. We're talking about economic development here. And I think, from the 30,000-foot level, and I agree with Mr. Sharp, there's got to be a holistic approach with an entity that has the bigger picture in mind and basically no dog in the race that can coordinate each of these other partners. And when you look at the airport, yeah, they have a role here, but their mission is the port. And the airport, the Port Authority, yeah, they have a dog in the race, but their mission is boats and ships. To me, either the MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, or the Planning Commission are the two entities that we need to be looking at. Whether or not we have a lot of heavy lifting here with some legislative changes is irrelevant. That ultimately, if we want the best machine possible to take this to the next level and operate it, we need to do that lifting here and now. And I think if we're unified, our legislative delegation would be encumbered to work with us. It would be foolish not to work with us if we are unified. And that leads me then to the question, which one of those two would be better for the position? And ultimately, I think that we go back to, well, with the MPO, there are certain expectations from the state because we fit into an overall statewide regional plan. Would this be stepping outside of that role and scope? Where with the Planning Commission, that's kind of a creature of our own here, and one that, quite frankly, has been the stepchild with everybody at this table. Maybe it's time to take a look at that stepchild and re-engineer it so it becomes our best friend and our blood brother. And maybe this is the opportunity to develop that by giving them a new and improved mission.
Okay.
So I just want to throw that out on the table as food for thought.
Okay. I certainly imagine all of you be chewing on it. But let me, the common point between the two of you is you really need this agency to be able to take a holistic view of the county as a whole and all the transportation functions and think about how they all work together. And I failed to say this earlier, we're not asking for any kind of decision from you today. We really just want to have a discussion. Chairman Suarez?
Okay, I've got a quick question of the folks that talked, some of the staff. When we're talking about transportation, we're talking about roads and road building in addition to any transit, am I correct?
Yes.
When we're talking implementation, that means money. So are we talking about having control over county dollars in order to build roads that county has purview over? Same thing with FDOT, that type of thing. I mean, is it holistic in that way?
Yes.
That this governing agency might have control over?
Yes, it is. And I think, so an example of that would be, I may have mentioned it last time, the county, Board of County Commissioners gave $40 million plus or minus to HART to build the Metro Rapid system and some other ancillary pieces. So there were buses, there were also road improvements that were needed and intersection improvements. And so it was a multifaceted project, not just buses. But they were the ones, but HART was the one that executed it all. They didn't do all of it themselves, they contracted with whomever, but we actually gave that $40 million to HART. It was theirs to draw down from the bank. We didn't get in the middle of it, and really what happened was a really good story, because at the end of the day, they got it done on time, they saved money, they actually gave us money back. But it allowed them to see the whole project, all its pieces, be accountable, get it done. And I think, to answer your question, that's exactly what would happen here. If there was funding coming from any of the jurisdictions, we'd have to make that commitment to the new HART line, so they knew they had the funding in the bank, so to speak.
See, but here's the question, because you just gave an example of something that worked very well,
Right.
which is a great coordination between HART and the county in terms of putting together our Metro Rapid north-south.
Right.
The question is that if we're talking about another entity, that are they going to have control over those projects that they are now making a decision as a board and using those dollars directly from county taxpayers? My point in saying this is that you've got a county road department that does a lot of different things and not just help pay for the project that we partnered with you all through HART, but you do other things too. Is that going to include everything underneath your purview as a county road department, or is it just going to be specific projects? So I think that there's, on the implementation side, I think that's a great example, but there are so many other things that your county road department, our transportation division does at the city that is kind of overarching, that as a governing board from the city's perspective, we like to have control over certain dollars and other things we do, and I'm sure that the county commissioners and the county administration would also like to continue to have control over, because when we're talking about MPO projects, when we're talking about the way the MPO sets those priorities, and Commissioner Lott was very eloquent one day when we were at MPO and said the reason why we've had these 5-year lists of projects is because it takes out a lot of the politics of it, so that you know that there is a set time frame for projects. We reprioritize, we know what's coming up, we sit as a collegial board and we make a decision. And again, I'm not sure that we're getting to that critical mass that we need either a better implementing board or a better governing board yet. I mean, and I wanted to get with the implementation first, because I think that we need to flesh that out a little bit more to understand how each one of the local governments, Temple, Terrace, Plant City, and City of Tampa, are going to be in relation to how the county does their job too, and whether or not there's going to be a collegial board that actually makes those decisions the way we do at MPO, or whether or not we just continue to do what we do now, which is MPO is really the transportation planning department, and then we implement it through our individual governments or through HART. And to Commissioner Chris' discussion, we've, talking about the stepchild of Planning Commission, we've got the father of the Planning Commission over here, at least the stepfather. And, one of the things with Planning Commission is that because their overarching mission is more than just transportation, and talking about the way that we use land and what it means within our own comprehensive plans, either within the city or the county, it may be more of a stretch to include them just in the transportation end. They're a part of it, but they're not as important as the MPO, at least in my mind. So, and when the implementation part, I wanted to get a sense of, when we're talking overarching and holistic, are you also talking about governance on that holistic piece, which means that, dollars would have to flow directly to this entity, new or refigured, and how is that going to work in terms of our process? So that's something to think about in terms of how we really implement it.
So that's a topic we're beginning to have discussions at the project manager level. We'll have them with these folks, and we can bring them back unless any of you'd like to reply today. But good food for our thought. We'll be chewing on it. You know what?
Great.
Great that I listened to you at MPO.
I spoke one time and you remember it, that's good. No, I guess where I thought, and I'm always trying to see where we're all going together, you know, because we all came into this, we all had separate ideas, and it seems like each meeting we come a little more closer, you know. And I guess the direction I think we're going in, and I'm just kind of throwing this out there, going, is this where we're going, or are we far from that? Is to have, to me, it's two decisions here. It's that who's going to implement, and is it going to be the governing board is it going to be, let's say if HART was the implementing body, is the HART board the implementing board, is, you know, the governing board, or is it a separate board? That's where we're at today, right? Or is it expanding the HART board, or, because I think if I was looking at this, to me, where I'd be the most comfortable at today, not saying it might be different 4 months from now or 6 months from now, but I mean, if we had a gun to our head and had to vote today, you know, I would say we'd pick one of our, you know, entities that would best serve in implementing, okay? But then I would still say that if these dollars are being held back to accountable to the voters, they're going to expect to have an elected body that represents the entire county, okay, to governing these projects and these decisions. And then once that decision is made, then if it was HART, that's the implementing body, they would then implement it. So that's where I'm seeing this thing going to. Is that kind of where we're all at, or are we all still in separate directions? Or did I say that eloquently enough there? You know?
I think you did.
Okay, thank you.
And I think, Vice Mayor, today we're really just trying to hear all your perspectives so that we can start to package it in various ways, Commissioner Mayor.
Yeah, thank you. I think it all begins by first defining what are we talking about as transportation. Commissioner Sharp, I think, had mentioned that for the longest time, HART's mission was about running buses and getting people from point A to B. Well, I think, at least what I have learned over my tenure here, is that transportation is much more about that. Roads are part of the transit system. We also have different modes of transportation that doesn't involve motor vehicles. They involve bicycles. They involve all sorts of different vehicles. So I think we need to first define what we're speaking of as transportation. And then, I'm looking at the path of least resistance. If you look at our chart that our county attorney had set out, the agency that right now has been charged with the implementation of transportation has been HART. I believe the basic structure is there. I don't think the way that it looked at, if you're looking at the elected officials, I'm fine with the composition. The thing is, I think that it needs to be refined some to include others that would represent the pieces that we talked about when we're looking at for roads and when we're talking about economic development. So I would look at redefining of what HART looks like today. And my suggestion is that we look at, with the exception of Plant City, we would need to get you all in because we believe that you're going to come on board and contribute to the revenue streams for transportation. So, other than adding some of the basic things like that, I look at the rest of these when we're talking about FDOT, when we're talking involving the MPO and the Planning Commission. I look at them as having a seat as ex officio in an advisory board. The thing that Mr. Merrill talked about as far as what we had done from the county commission to HART, I think that's a great relationship. So if the HART acts as the planning board, and if we have representatives from these different agencies that can talk about the plans for roads, that can talk about the impact of economic development, I think it can be done from one body. HART has the biggest piece, which is the financing structure. MPO Planning Commission, nobody else, we all know it takes the purse strings. The purse strings has the largest amount of power. And that's why T-BARTA doesn't work that well, because they don't have the ability to be able to tax, even though they may have other limited financing capabilities. So I think HART is the perfect structure. We just need to redefine it and perhaps relook at the makeover. And that's my personal position of where we need to go.
Okay. Commissioner Merman.
Thank you, and I totally agree. I think Commissioner Beckner and Commissioner Sharp and I, who sit on the HART board, both agree that we need to take this transportation group to a level above where it's been. They are just, they're providing good service with great people working there, but it's not getting us where we need to go for the future. And we've got too many needs. They need too much money. We need to reconstitute. It's an internal and external issue for me. And we have to get our leaders in a decision-making mode. I sit on 5 of the 12 boards that are on that list. Every single one of them, every single month, say something different. And if we don't figure out right now to get a governing entity to say what roles these people have so that they do what we want them to do, not what they tell us to do, I think we're never going to reach what we want to get out of this. And it's not being critical of anybody. It's just that everybody's, constantly, we leave here, one of the agencies will try and one-up another. And it's this battling, operating in a vacuum, mode of survival that I think the attitude has to quit. It can quit right here. Reconstituting, like Commissioner Beckner says, really gets us to a point where we need to go. Because at the end of the day, the external issues are that accountability, accessibility, affordability, getting people to want to leave their cars to get into a mode of transportation, and to get that choice rider, that guy that has a great job making $60,000 a year at Raymond James or USAA or wherever they are, getting them to take public transportation. That's our job. That's what we need to get done. And if we've got to get a governing entity that can start to tell our community and engage them at the same time to say, well, how we're going to do this and get there.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner.
See, I look at it from a little different perspective. I don't see this as primarily mass transportation. I think it's a bigger picture. We're talking ultimately the final destination here with what we're doing is economic development and improved quality of life. So starting at that point and working ourselves backwards from there, we're looking at all the modes, holistically, all the modes of transportation. Not just a bus or a trolley or a train, but we're looking at the automobile, the bicycle, and even walking. We're looking at the whole picture. And we've identified all the economic development areas for potential business and job development, and we're trying to link those to where people live and reside and how we're going to move people back and forth. And we really need an entity that can take the bigger picture and work with it. And I feel, going with HART is really no different than going with the airport authority or going with the port authority, because those are what I call singular myopic organizations that have one mission. HART's mission is just to move people, not to create economic development districts, not to work pedestrian traffic, not to work with, the outlying issues that are going to be involved here. And, we may find that we don't have the money to do all kinds of fancy modes of mass transportation within the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. We may have to work with what we have until we get to that point. And if we take an organization whose primarily mission has been thinking, planning, organizing, strategizing, bringing partners together, then we get to approach this from that higher level position of where we're trying to go.
I'm going to back away from the specific organizations, but what I hear the three of you saying consistently is we need somebody who has a broad look. We need an entity that can really provide leadership here and get some consistency of effort in this community. And where we wind up, those are really key capacities that I hear.
Yeah, but
That's Commissioner Miller.
like Commissioner Chris said a little differently. I'm gonna agree with Commissioner Chris. Y'all write that down.
Got it.
I got it right.
Timestamp.
I agree.
The top of this page says transportation for economic development, and that's exactly what he's talking about. Is HART the agency we need to have doing this? One of the things, and where our legislative hat, I think that we're so far behind on is because we have so many agencies out there that everyone's trying to protect their own turf. That's what's been happening in the past. You look at Orange County and Miami-Dade, they don't have all those agencies out there, and they have a one voice that could, that's what I say, one voice. They have at least a couple of voices that could speak for what they need there, plus they had power in the legislature to get certain things done. We have not done that. And I agree with Commissioner Chris, is HART may be the agency we need to look at prospectively, but we have to look at the overall picture. And I thought we were also talking about not only transportation, we started talking about transportation economic development. And is HART the agency by itself to get that done? Will they be the agency that will be out there speaking on behalf of what all these entities we're talking about? Is that HART? Commissioner Beckner talked about having ex officio members sitting on HART. Ex officio meaning what? They do not vote? They have, they just sit there? I don't know how we get to that point to have the HART agency with members sitting as ex officio getting these certain things done. I don't know. I just think that we have to look at the overall big picture. We start talking about transportation. HART has the mission of moving people, just like he said. But when we start talking about down the road in the future, every aspect of this county, including South County, has to be looked at in that. And how do we get to that point, and what agency would be that point, that overall voice to speak on our behalf? I don't know if HART, if we just pinpoint and pigeonhole one agency, is that it? I don't know if they can get there. I really don't.
And again, we're not, to be clear, we're not trying to get there today. You just want to hear different perspectives. Commissioner Merman?
The county administrator wanted to say something. Mike?
Pardon me?
I thought you wanted to speak.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just want to be sure that, you know, I can clarify for us from the managers group what it is that we're saying, because I think there might be some confusion. We're not at all suggesting that whatever agency that you choose is the economic development agency. That's reserved to the Economic Development Corporation. What we're saying is that just like TIA, just like the Port Authority, just like the Sports Authority, they all have a responsibility within their own expertise to help create economic development and jobs. So we're not saying that this agency that you would recreate or create would be responsible for economic development. They would be responsible for transportation as it contributes to economic development in the county. The other clarification, I think, is that, speaking for Chip, and he can run up here and tell me if I'm wrong, but any of the agencies that he's presented to you today would have to be modified to achieve what you're trying to do. So it's, whether it's the Planning Commission, the MPO, any of those agencies would have to be reconstructed, a different mission, different authority, and so that shouldn't, suggesting not be the determining factor, because you'll have to make that change no matter what you decide. And the question is, what's the, from a time point of view, what can be achieved most quickly, and from an operating point of view, you know, what makes the most sense. And so if bus rapid transit is going to become one of the key foundations of your plan, it might make sense then that HART become that agency, because you're already starting with an agency and now you're adding to its palette, so to speak, other features, but you're starting with an agency that's already got the main focus of the
Commissioner
effort.
Merman, Commissioner Sharp, Commissioner Beckman.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you cleared that up, because the exercise of the economic spaces and all was just to tell us where the economic activity is going to go, so that when we do the transportation, it's going to connect everything so people can get around to their jobs. It's not that this agency or whatever entity we're looking at is not going to do economic development. And I'm glad, I want to jump in and clear that up, because, and I think we have to go back to a recommendation from you all, and that is, don't worry about the entity right now. Make the list of, he said, the roles and the functions. And then I think it will become clear to us what entity fits that paradigm, rather than taking the cart before the horse and say, oh my gosh, let's go to HART and reconstitute. You know, we've got fragmentation here we've got to work with, figure out who's going to be, what we want this entity to do. So I think our next meeting should be about looking at the roles and the functions. so that we can discuss entity.
Well said, Commissioner, far better than I, and that's exactly what we had a discussion with you, so we can come back next time and have a more refined discussion. Mr. Sharp.
I would just as well suggest, I mean, we're not doing something that hasn't been done before. The military did this. When I went to Central Command, it had just transformed from the Joint Deployment Task Force. They had a big mission, and it was operational, but they didn't have all the entities involved to be able to accomplish their mission. A lot of it was just moving ships to the Persian Gulf. So they reoriented themselves, they reorganized, and became U.S. Central Command. And they had many elements and components of other agencies that participated and worked together collaboratively. Now, according to the memorandum of understanding that was established, they were required to work together, which is something we don't do and we should do, but they worked together to accomplish the mission. They still had to speak to the Commander-in-Chief, Congress, and all these other leaders. They still had to answer to whether it was the city, the county, other interest, but they were focused on mission, and that's why I'm very cautious about handing it over to a planning agency. I would prefer that it be an operational agency that already knows how to operate, but just has expanded responsibilities and functions. And as part of their purview, which I think Commissioner Beckner kind of laid out, it's not like we have to create a whole new organization or entity, but it does have responsibilities that go beyond where it is today. Because oftentimes they will say it's not our responsibility, or we don't have the authority, or we can't tell them to do this. And so great ideas turn to naught because of the structure. So I would think HART is the natural, and if you look to other military commands where this has been done, they've done it quite well, and we could do it, and we could operate it flawlessly.
Commissioner Beckner.
And not to repeat what's already been said, but to make it real clear, the intent is that HART would not take over all the different roles that we talked about. What we're looking at doing is refining an agency that can speak to larger bodies such as the legislature, the federal government, or whomever for transportation for the needs of our community. And if you take a look, and and we know what the challenges sometimes have been before, is that have already been mentioned, is that you've got the MPO that will come out and will say one thing, you've got the Planning Commission might say this, and you're getting all of these different agencies doing all this different planning. If you take one agency that has the operational function like HART does, and then if you integrate the arms of the other agency, you now have linked all of these agencies together so that they can meet and they can speak and have conversation and be on one page. And that's what you have the ability to create. HART has the operations to carry out the transportation, the MPO with Planning Commission, you got the planning arms of it. If you insert economic development, everybody can sit in the room and have a conversation. I don't think we're talking about creating a super agency where we're gonna have all these staffs combined. Everybody will still play their own function. They will just come in one boardroom, one meeting, and be able to discuss what each one of the agencies are doing and their role, and we can all plan together and speak with one voice. And that's what I think, again, makes so much more sense for HART to do this.
Thank you all for the conversation today. It will continue. I would like to get to our final agenda item, if that's with your agreement. And that's the last time you asked us to talk about public engagement. So we worked on some ideas. Eric, if you'll come up and present them.
Should have this slide. Eric Johnson with Hillsborough County. And recognizing the time, what I'd like to do is have you skip the first bullet. And we are looking for reaction from you, but to talk about where we are with public engagement, just as you have a project management group that's been meeting weekly for the last 9 to 10 months, and more recently established a finance group that is working on options for how we currently use transportation dollars and how we may use alternate sources of funding. We did bring together your PR people to start to talk about how do we engage the public. And I think you know that we've had prior public engagement. We had a series of 5 meetings throughout the community. I know that there are people in the audience today that have recently asked what's the next step in terms of public engagement, because I've talked to them over the last 30 days. The key here is how do we move forward? One of the lessons that we've learned is there's a lot of interest in transportation. There's also a lot of curiosity about what is it exactly that we're talking about, and to date we haven't had, until very recently, specific projects, timeline, the ability to talk about how we may pay for things. And so we brought together the people from each of your organizations, and so starting with the methods, these are the things that they came up with that they would like some reaction to. We have had discussions with other entities, but you've talked some about that just in this most recent governance discussion. So clearly, coordinating between all the various entities that deal with transportation issues is one of the things that they've identified. A speakers bureau, whether it's the members of this committee, whether it's your managers going out. While we've had the opportunity to have meetings and invite people to come to our meetings, what they talked about is get out into the community. There are a variety of organizations that are already scheduling meetings, and so have a speakers bureau that can go out and attend those meetings that already are being scheduled, that have attendance that's essentially guaranteed, and start to communicate with those people and both share your message as well as to hear back in terms of feedback from their perspective. As you look at these specific job centers, the key economic spaces, they talked about the importance of talking to the businesses in those areas. You heard early in this process, we had some business leaders come in and talk to you from pretty much a broad perspective and a high altitude. But if last month we talked about Sable Park, do we want to actually have the opportunity to hear from business people in the Sable Park area, for example, and get their reaction to the specific projects and how they think that will meet their needs? Clearly, the general public, the opportunity to tie in the MPO has a long-range transportation plan that requires some community engagement. So we've talked about partnering with that so that there's a single message to the community and a single message back from the community rather than mixed messages as people get confused who's asking which questions for which purpose. There was a discussion in an earlier meeting about having a town hall or town hall meetings. You know, do you want to have some public discussion? Councilmember Suarez was at that first public engagement meeting when we had so many people show up on the second floor that we used this room for overflow. Certainly there were a lot of people that would like the opportunity to engage with elected officials, not staff. And so that's another issue, another opportunity for you to start to get input. The question for you, and the reason I skipped the first bullet, is what's the appropriate time to do that? When do you think that we have enough details to communicate to the public and for the public to react to, that you want to start to engage the public yourselves in possibly a town hall meeting approach? In terms of the media, your management group has met twice with the two major newspapers in our market, but clearly going forward, the opportunity to engage the media in order to make sure that they understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, when you're doing it, and to get their questions. They had excellent questions when the group met with each of those papers last week. And then the last opportunity that they've suggested is, what type of survey instruments do you want to use, and do you want to use them? Do you want to go out and have a statistically significant survey? On the other hand, do you feel bound if the results of that are not consistent with what you're hearing? So, you know, I'll stop talking other than to say, at this point, we simply set out there a target date of June, in part based on the MPO process for community engagement for the update of the long-range transportation plan. But we put this together to really engage you in what you expect and what you'd like to see in terms of that process.
Any feedback? Commissioner Merman, Commissioner Beckens?
I think I would like to adopt the public outreach method that Polk County used. It's not that I'm opposed to the MPO survey, but they just got done with 2040. They ran the referendum last time. I think I just would rather have a clean, very clean, independent citizen outreach that is just going to go out there, just like Polk County did. Polk County, very successful. I think they had 12,000 respondents or 15,000, something like that. I think we would get, and we'd probably have to hire a company to do it, some kind to do an outreach. But I think the plan is good. I don't think We're gonna be ready to go out to the public with this, though, till probably after summer. It's gonna take a while to put a plan together, digest it, for us to digest it, and then go out and present it. But those are my thoughts.
Commissioner Reckner?
Well, I guess I would also agree. I like the Polk County approach. I would also, when we talk about a target date start in June, you had mentioned that, is it, staff is already lined up to start talking about the long-term?
The MPO has
The MPO.
to do their outreach, at least beginning in July at least, right, Ray?
Yes. And what Polk County, do you remember, was related to transit?
Yeah.
It was very focused on transit.
Yeah, and the only thing is, I'm assuming that we're talking about the communication of our plan, or we're looking at outreach to get more input to create a plan?
Well, obviously it's your direction, but we have framed it as the communication of your plan.
Okay. Because from what I thought you had outlined before, Herb, I didn't think we were going to be done and ready with a plan until sometime in the summer.
Well, Mr. Merrill has put us on a very aggressive schedule.
Okay.
So, at the risk of our own personal exhaustion and depth, we promise to have it done by June.
Okay. Well, as long as we have a thoughtful plan that we're putting out, I mean, that's what we need to communicate.
And
that's
I think
what
we really want.
That's what I'm assuming that we're talking about forming a communication plan for.
And our basic message is we certainly don't want to go to y'all are comfortable and feel like it's right. We simply don't want to hold you up, but we'll entirely defer to your judgment about the right time.
If I could add to that, just in terms of that question of timing, there are people that are concerned that this is going to be too well-baked before you start to take public input. So I think part of the question for you and the direction that we're looking for is, how far do you want to be through this process before you allow the public to start to ask questions, make suggestions? And we're open to where you'd like to go. But if you go too far through the process before you start to get feedback, then at some point the feedback you may hear is, we would have liked to have the opportunity before you were done, and so that's part of the question mark that we're raising.
Well, I think we have to have something comprehensive to present. I mean, I do not see us going out here and say, what do y'all think about transportation in Hillsborough County, y'all? Give us your feedback. We need something that the public can digest and comment on. And so, I mean, at least right now, we haven't even gotten remotely to the point of putting together something that we want to put out. So I just want something, again, people can comment on.
Any other feedback?
Herb, I do have a question, just based on some of the comments that have been made. Just quickly, what we want to do certainly is cover all the corners and all angles before we move forward. And just by looking at some of these key economic spaces, it was mentioned earlier, there's a big gap between Plain City and where this main pocket is. Also South County. If there's going to be any kind of referendums that move forward, there's folks down there that vote, and that can offset it. And I'm even looking here, and there's not, Carrollwood's pretty active. I don't see any economic dots out there either. And these are, when you guys start hitting the different parts of town, it's good to hit all the parts, so there is no disconnect, but because it'll be certain groups from some of these areas that come in and say, there's nothing in it for us. So, we've all been there, we've discussed it, but I think some of those comments were alluded to earlier, and to get buy-in, we have to have sort of a balanced plan.
You're absolutely right, and let me just reiterate, what we're taking you through now are the key economic spaces. As soon as we get through that, we need to look at how the whole thing works as a system, and that's where you start to get the other areas that may not show up on a purple circle, but they're key to moving people in and out of work. So, before we're finished with, let me just call it the first draft that you might want to take out, we'll need to look at it as a whole. We need to fold in the competitive sites, what that might be. So, yes, sir, we hear you. And
you guys are doing a great job. Just a lot of work's been going on with this, but you're fully aware of it.
Yeah.
But if you're going to start and going out into the communities, and there's not any dots in some of these areas,
Sure.
You're going to get some heat coming your direction.
Well,
or we are,
and that's,
whoever's out there.
Well, yeah, we don't want to go till y'all say it's ready. And that's, we won't, because we certainly need to do that.
Thank you.
Any questions and comments before we adjourn today? Thank y'all very much for the discussion today, very helpful.